Let's begin. Responding to the challenge of climate change. Tonight's guest in our spring series webinar is Professor Sir Jim Skea. Jim is the chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. And the IPCC is the United Nations body for assessing the science related to climate change, its impact and the future risks it presents, as well as options for adaptation and mitigation. Jim was a member of the UK Committee on Climate Change from its inception in 2008 up until 2018, and he was also the chair of Scotland's Just Transition Commission from 2018 to 2023. Before he was the chair of the IPCC, Jim was the Professor of Sustainable Energy at Imperial College London, and he's also served as Research Director of the UK Energy Research Centre and Director of the Policy Studies Institute before that. Jim has lots of letters. He was awarded an OBE for services to sustainable transport in 2004, a CBE for services to sustainable energy in 2013, and in 2024, Jim was awarded a knighthood in the King's Birthday Honours List for services to global leadership in climate science. It's an incredible career with deep expertise in energy, climate change, and technological innovation. We're really looking forward to hearing what you have to say, Jim. Thank you, and over to you.
Okay, thanks, Marianne. I think you've left me some time to make the presentation. That was quite a long introduction, so thanks for that. So I'm going to share a presentation which you should see on the screen very shortly. I think it's up there now. And just to say that I'm going to go through a few things. I am going to explain what IPCC is and how it works, because sometimes it's quite a mysterious organisation. I've been involved continuously since 2008, and it's still a mystery to me in some ways. I'll then go on to describe some of the key findings from the last IPCC reports, more at a global level. And since the first word of the title is responding, I do want to get into the issue of what we can do about climate change and the more actionable elements. And what I'll do to finish off, since it's the campaign for the protection of rural England, I will focus more on some of IPCC's activities around the issue of land and land use. So just to kick off, what is IPCC? I think some people kind of imagine it's 5 professors sitting in the back of a pub discussing research results. It's absolutely not that. This is a picture of a full IPCC meeting from 2 weeks ago in Bangkok with about 300 government representatives from around 110 countries. There are probably only 25 or 30 scientists actually in the room. And if you peer closely, you will see the silver head in the middle of the podium. It's me actually chairing the session. So IPCC is actually quite a big and complicated beast. And Marianne actually took most of this slide from me. Our role is not to do our own research, it's to assess the science that's out there. And it's not just the physical science, it's the socioeconomic aspects as well, the societal responses and the options for adaptation and mitigation. And you can see all the adjectives at the top of the screen: comprehensive, objective, open and transparent, etc. And the final thing I need to flag on it is that we are neutral with respect to policy. You will never find a recommendation in an IPCC report. What you will find is a kind of if-then statement. If a policy option were to be exercised, these are the consequences. That's the kind of approach that we take. Now, in terms of the structure of IPCC, it is very complicated. On the left-hand side, the governmental bit of it, and the fact that the I stands for intergovernmental means that the governments are incredibly important. They tend to meet as governments twice a year, typically, throughout an IPCC cycle, which lasts for 7 years altogether. We don't produce reports on a kind of 24/7 basis. The governments, for every 7-year cycle, elect a scientific leadership, which consists of the chair, 3 vice chairs, and then co-chairs and vice chairs of individual working groups who are in the middle of the screen. And the 3 working groups cover the physical sciences, impacts, adaptation and vulnerability, and mitigation, which effectively means all the things you can do to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. And we have a rather mysterious part of IPCC, the fourth part, called the Task Force on National Greenhouse Gas Inventories, which develops the methods by which governments report their emissions to the Framework Convention on Climate Change. I won't be giving that much mention, though it is actually quite important. And finally, on the right-hand side of the screen, there are all the volunteer scientists and experts that actually write the IPCC reports over the cycle. And there are hundreds of these altogether. We've got something like 800 of them for the current cycle, who are all sort of busy working away at producing the IPCC reports. So in a nutshell, that is the way that IPCC operates. Just to turn it into the more human side of it, what an IPCC meeting looks like in full action. Top left-hand corner, we have governments meeting first thing on a Monday morning in orderly rows, starting the meeting in a very dignified kind of way. During the middle of the week, we will much often break into smaller groups, so-called contact groups or huddles, to discuss and thrash out particular issues. That's an orderly one in the top right-hand corner. The bottom left-hand corner is a disorderly huddle when things get very tense as you go into meetings, perhaps by the Thursday of the week. And it's only on the final Friday, perhaps, a whole day later after working a whole night, sometimes that the gavel comes down and you complete the exercise. So it is indeed quite an intense body overall. Just to say, the volume of the things they produce. I took this photograph earlier this afternoon of all the products for the IPCC sixth cycle that ran from 2015 to 2023, 8 years with a delay because of COVID. So you can see the picture. 30 kilograms worth of reports, 10,000 pages. If I spent my half an hour recounting it, I would have to do 5 pages a second to get through everything, which is clearly impossible. But you can see 2,000 words on the physical sciences, 3,000 pages on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability, 2,000 pages on mitigation. We then have a synthesis report, the thin one that's standing there, that tries to pull together the key conclusions at the end of the cycle. And during the last cycle, we also produced 3 special reports on global warming of 1.5 degrees, climate change and land, which I'll come back to, and the ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate. And I may say the global warming of 1.5 degrees, the special report in 2018, was particularly influential and quite a big landmark for IPCC. Now, each of these reports is long, and it takes an awful lot of effort to put them together. And typically, from the time that the governments start to think about producing a report, it can be 3 to 4 years before the report actually hits the streets. And this is broken down into 10 simple stages overall. So there's a scientific scoping meeting where scientists get together to think about what the content of a report on a particular topic might look like. And they produce an outline, which is not the final outline, because at stage 2, that has to go to governments and they have to agree what the final outline of the report is. And usually they fiddle with small numbers of words, but I haven't really seen them change chapter structures. It's only after you've got an outline that you can go and invite governments and our observer organisations to nominate authors to write the report. And it's the job of the bureau members, all the co-chairs and vice chairs that I mentioned, to select from the authors with regard to regional balance, gender, stage of career, whether they've had IPCC experience or not. The authors then get down and start writing a set of drafts. There's a first order draft that goes out for review by experts only. We advertise that widely, and almost anybody can nominate themselves as an expert to review. And this is particularly challenging because every comment is published after the report is published, and every author's response to every comment is also published. And if I tell you that a recent special report on climate change in cities, a special report with only 5 chapters, got 30,000 comments on its first order draft, you realise what a large job that is. So the authors then respond to the comments. They produce a second order draft at stage 6, which goes for review by both governments and experts. And then that is finally redrafted to produce a final report and the critical document, the summary for policymakers, perhaps 30 pages long, which summarizes the key conclusions. The governments take that summary for policymakers. They then review it once again at stage 8. The authors revise it in view of the comments. And then the penultimate stage is actually to approve that summary for policymakers at a full plenary session of IPCC with all the governments there. And that is the famous painful stage, because we go through that summary for policymakers paragraph by paragraph, line by line, and word for word, and negotiate by consensus between governments and scientists what that summary for policymakers should say. So the final output at stage 10, when IPCC produces a report, isn't something that's been casually thought of by scientists. It's an elaborate process that involves governments and scientists, and it's probably the most rigorous review process that anyone can imagine. And that's the reason why the IPCC reports carry such authority, because they've gone through this incredible process. And no government, because they've signed up for it by consensus, can back away from the conclusions of an IPCC report. Now, I'm trying to, instead of having these sort of Bill Gates, Microsoft kind of diagrams, to remind that this is all about real people. This is what the membership of the lead authors meeting for IPCC would look like, between 200 and 250 authors gathered together for a week in a particular location. And this happens to be, I was co-chair of Working Group 3 on mitigation in the last cycle, and our first lead author meeting was held at the University of Edinburgh. So this is a picture of the entire author team on the left-hand side, and a picture of smiling authors in a team meeting on the right-hand side. So to demonstrate this is all about people as well as the more abstract processes that you can see. Now, I'm going to turn on to some of the key conclusions that we have reached at a global level. And can I say something about this? Because we talk a lot about how we're going to message our reports and get them out. Because a lot of criticisms made about climate scientists is that they scare people by telling very frightening stories about the risks that we face. And these risks are real, but on the other hand, the message we get is that continuous messages about risk can be very disempowering because people feel very helpless about the challenges we face. So without playing down the risks, we also try to pay a lot of attention to human agency, what we can actually do in response to climate change. So keep that in mind, when I'm giving the messages, and I will get on to responses very shortly. So one thing I want to flag in the background is the global picture. There isn't much fairness about climate change. So a big message that globally emissions are distributed unevenly, both in the present day and historically. So on the left-hand side of this slide, it's showing the historical picture, carbon dioxide emissions for different regions of the world since the start of the industrial era, which we typically take as 1850. And I won't go into the detail, but you can see that North America and Europe, between them, account for about 40% of historical emissions of carbon dioxide emissions. Switch to the right-hand side of the picture, and that's a snapshot of emissions in 2019, and it's the per capita emissions, the emissions per head of population, total greenhouse gas emissions, which includes methane and other gases as well as carbon dioxide. And you can see still this huge discrepancy between different parts of the world. North America, nearly 20 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per capita. Europe has actually improved. It's been one of the fastest reducing areas of greenhouse gas emissions, now sitting at about 8 tons of carbon dioxide per capita, now less than Latin America, less than Eastern Asia, which is dominated by China, and less than, as you can see, Eastern Europe, Middle East, Australia, Japan, and New Zealand. And the striking thing that we want to point out, I think here really, look at the other end of this curve, Africa and Southern Asia, which is dominated by India. You're looking at 2 to 3 tons of of greenhouse gas emissions per capita. So that divergence between different suppliers and the inequities that are implied, I think, are really, really critical. So another way of looking at it, we have this particularly striking figure from our last synthesis report, which on the horizontal axis shows emissions per capita of different countries, and on the vertical axis shows the vulnerability of populations to climate change using various vulnerability indices. And a very, very strong message that those who've contributed least to climate change are the most vulnerable. So it's making this inequity point, which is very important in an international body like IPCC. It's just making it incredibly clear. Now, because there are 10,000 pages to summarize in a few minutes, one thing that I find quite useful to do is to map IPCC findings against the 3 goals of the Paris Agreement, which is obviously just over 10 years old now. And there are 3 goals. The first one is the long-term temperature goal. And that goal is the whole paragraph. It's not a specific number. Limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees and pursuing efforts to limit the increase to 1.5 degrees. And there's been an increasing emphasis on 1.5 degrees in the last 10 years. So let me say that this goal gets a particular amount of attention, especially in the European arena. It's the one that tends to dominate. The second goal is to increase the ability to adapt to the adverse impacts of climate change, foster climate resilience in a way that doesn't threaten food production, and for example. And the third one is to make financial flows, implicitly those from developed to developing countries, consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilience, and to do all of that in the context of sustainable development and efforts to eradicate poverty. These are the goals of the Paris Agreement, and our findings play in to each of these goals. And one thing to flag, there is no one goal that is more important than the other. They are all interlocked together. If we don't achieve the first goal, we are going to have to make more efforts on the second goal in terms of fostering climate resilience. And many of our colleagues in developing countries will feel reluctant to join in efforts to reduce emissions to hit the first goal unless they see financial flows emerging that address some of the inequities that I mentioned in the first few slides. So keep that in mind. It's all 3 goals that are actually important. So in the last cycle, we had the 3 working group reports on physical science, impacts, adaptation and vulnerability and mitigation, and then the synthesis report that pulled it all together. And one of the most striking phrases that was agreed was that human activities, principally through emissions of greenhouse gases, have unequivocally caused global warming. And every country from Samoa to Saudi Arabia signed up to that statement. It's, the consensus around it is really striking, and that carries implications. You'll notice from the covers of the reports, the one I was helping to lead on was the one at the bottom left on the mitigation of climate change. And I have to say, in a Working Group 3 report, we had never to that point had a human being on the front cover of the report. So we were determined to do that. And we chose this picture because it showed people growing their own food. There's a bicycle in the bottom left-hand corner, solar panels on highly efficient housing. And we actually, when we chose it, we didn't know where this was located. And we had a big guessing game to find out. And to my completely surprise with my Scottish accent, it is actually in Scotland. It's in the village of Findhorn. And of course, I felt my obligation to go there and talk to some of the people who were actually living in the houses. And they're delighted to see themselves on the front cover of an IPCC report. Now, just turning to the long-term temperature goal in the Paris Agreement. Sorry for the graphs. I don't have too many graphs in this presentation. But this is showing emissions of greenhouse gases back to 2010 in historical emissions, then projected emissions under different scenarios out to 2050. And basically, if we carry on with our current policies, it's the salmon pink band of emission expectations at the top of the slide, with slight increases by 2050, 2030 emissions higher than in 2020. But if we are going to limit to warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees, the sort of bands that bracket the goal in the Paris Agreement, we would need to be on an emissions reduction pathway already, which we are plainly not. We are halfway through that time, the 2020s, and we have not made progress. We are still on that salmon pink slice at the top. And we'd need to reduce emissions by about 40% compared with 2020 levels to put us on the 1.5 degree pathway. The purple band with the kink in it shows what governments have committed to by 2030. And they have made these so-called nationally determined contributions, which would involve a slight decrease by 2030, but absolutely not enough to put us on track for reaching the Paris Agreement temperature goal. And furthermore, the policies we've put in place do not even allow us to meet the nationally determined contributions. So quite a negative picture there, which I will try to balance with some optimism in a few slides further down the line. And of course, a decade ago, we imagined maybe that climate change was something for the far distant future. We have already started to observe the consequences of climate change. It's something that's real, it's truly happening. We've got the wildfires, these are from California, the floods in Valencia in the top right-hand corner, coastal flooding in Asia, and drought in Africa. All of these things we can attribute back to climate change. And one of the things that some of our authors have been trying to do is get involved in so-called attribution. How confident can we be that a particular weather event or a particular climate extreme is associated with human-made climate change? And this is the kind of examples that we see there. We are absolutely confident that it is human activities that have caused observable increases in hot extremes that now make it extremely dangerous for people to even go outside for extended periods of time in hotter parts of the world. And when we were in Bangkok 2 weeks ago, where the temperature was about 36 degrees with 100% humidity, nobody was going outside simply because of the discomfort that you could experience there. So in all parts of the world, almost, we are highly confident that human beings have caused these hot extremes. There's little bit lower levels of confidence about other issues like flooding events, etc., but we still think it's probably the case. And in the longer term, it's likely that we will be able to attribute things like changes to food supply, for example, to the effects of climate change. And looking forward, something that we've done in the IPCC reports is to look at the risks associated with climate change. And for that, we've developed these things called the so-called burning ember diagrams. And they're burning embers for a reason, because they look like fire, they look hot, and they have a color range associated with the risks, which, believe me, isn't just for artistic effect. There's actually science behind the Pantone numbers, but behind these diagrams. And what happens? A yellow risk is a moderate risk that will affect some people that you can probably live with. A purple, very high risk, is one that is probably irreversible, is severe, affects huge numbers of people or huge areas of land. And what's striking about the land-based systems on the left-hand side is that between 1.5 and 2 degrees for biodiversity, wildfires, permafrost, you're seeing a significant escalation of risk between 1.5 and 2 degrees. The world is absolutely a more dangerous and unpleasant place at 2 degrees warming than it is at 1.5 degrees. Turn To the right-hand side, for ocean coastal ecosystems, perhaps some of the higher risks are emerging at higher levels, except for warm water or tropical corals, where we can already see the effect. At 1.5 degrees warming, we might lose about 3/4 of our warm water corals. If we move to 2 degrees, then they all go effectively. So these are the kind of risks that we're facing and that we are trying to communicate. And there are many other subtle, more complex effects. For example, on the productivity of food systems, not just food coming from land-based agriculture, but also fisheries go into decline as the oceans warm as well. So quite serious effects as we move forward. And you can compare that with the projections of where we are going to go in terms of temperature under different scenarios. If we carry on with current policies, we will have almost 3 degrees warming by the end of the century. If the unconditional elements of nationally determined contributions were to be implemented, that's one, for example, things that say a developing country says it will do it anyway, regardless of financial help, 2.5 degrees. If you take in conditional elements, those that are conditional on receiving additional funding, down to 2.3. And in the very best world of all, if all of the nationally determined contributions are met and all the net pledges that countries have made around the world for mid or the early part of the second half of the 20th century are fulfilled, we could just about keep global warming by 2 degrees at 1.9. So a strong message, if you consider that on the previous slide, you can see that we are entering a world of very high risks for climate change with the kind of projections that we are looking at the moment. Now, the final goal of the Paris Agreement was to make sure that financial flows were compatible with mitigating climate change and sustainable development. And just one slide there, which shows on the left-hand side of the darker blue bars refer to the current financial flows that we see to invest in reducing emissions. And the grey ones with the larger ranges of uncertainty is what you would need to do by 2030 to put you on a track towards limiting warming in line with the Paris Agreement. And the top level message is the financial flows would need to increase by a factor of being between 3 and 6 to put us on a track towards meeting the Paris Agreement goal. And the gaps are actually least for energy supply and electricity. The gaps are bigger for energy efficiency, transport, and especially agriculture, forestry, and other land use. Another key point to make, the gaps are also bigger for developing countries than for developed countries. So there's a wholly, kind of depressing picture. But as I said at the beginning, we do want to try to convey a message about the agency that human beings hold about their future. And one of the most striking figures from the last report that was picked up by a lot of journalists was essentially to look at a set of options and how they could reduce emissions of greenhouse gases in the short term. And so this slide refers to energy supply. And just to get a sense of the scale, the 6 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent are roughly 10% of current global emissions. And you can see the big opportunities in the energy sector are essentially with the renewables, wind and solar energy. And we can see the huge expansion that's taking place at the moment. And 4 gigatons, maybe about 7.5 or 7-8% of global emissions at the moment. So a big, big potential. And what's more, much of that potential is available at a cost that is less than zero. In other words, it makes sense to do it even without climate change and climate change incentives. So that is definitely the way the world is going. And we've seen very dramatic falls in the cost of renewable energy. And other elements to pick out there, bioelectricity. And one I pick out at the bottom is reduced methane emissions from oil and gas systems, something that's very cheap to do. People have missed lots of opportunities, It's very cost effective. Methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas with a short life, and it could really help to shave peak emissions and peak warming if we go that way. The other big sector that has a lot of potential is actually in relation to agriculture and forestry and other land use, to which we give the disgraceful acronym AFALU, and must remember to spell it out on every occasion. But big opportunities from carbon sequestration in agriculture, so managing land and livestock, reducing methane and nitrous oxide emissions in agriculture, and then a whole set of issues around conversion of forests, afforestation, avoided deforestation, ecosystem restoration, etc. And very controversially in the last cycle, we also introduced the idea of looking at the whole food chain, not just agriculture, but how food is consumed. So the question of balanced, sustainable, healthy diets, which I usually get a question about after making a presentation, but there's a big potential there. And also by 2030 in the long term, lots of potential around buildings and transport. And many of these are available, again, at a negative cost. It makes sense to do them in buildings, efficient lighting, appliances, equipment, in transport, efficient vehicles, moves to electrification, public transportation, and bikes and e-bikes. All of these things have a big potential. And let's not forget about shipping and aviation as well. So lots of potential in there. Now, one of the things IPCC has been criticised about in the past is that it's focused too much on technology and not enough on the people aspect of changing emissions. So one of the things we did in the last cycle was have a whole chapter devoted to consumption and the way that changing consumption patterns could actually help you manage with climate change. And basically the problem the author set up is, how do we meet human needs for nutrition, mobility, and shelter, and meet these needs in ways that have a lower carbon footprint? And from that, they concluded that greenhouse gas emissions could be reduced by between 40 to 70% in these end-use sectors by the middle of the century, with these different techniques. Now, just a couple of points to make about this. I won't go through the numbers in detail, but a strong message was that it wasn't just about individual consumer choice. It's important, but it won't work by itself. We also need to look at infrastructure use, the availability of infrastructure to allow people to make choices, and the availability of technologies for people to choose. And the classic example would be electric vehicles. People need to choose them, manufacturers need to provide the technologies, but you also need the charging infrastructure to give people the confidence to go out and purchase electric vehicles. It's a very strong message. Individual choice matters, but it needs to be supported by the context, which is also policy driven. And one thing we also emphasized there was the importance of the professions in helping to enable some of these changes. For example, architects, planners, etc., critically important in making progress in these demand-led areas. Now, I want to also flag that now that we are facing global warming of greater than 1.5 degrees, the world is likely to be over 1.5 degrees in a fairly semi-permanent way within the next 5 years or so, the way the world is warming up. So it's not just a case of reducing emissions. There are going to be big climate impacts that we are going to have to learn to live with. And we're going to pay a lot more attention to adaptation in the current cycle of IPCC. And just to say, the flag, progress with adaptation is probably less advanced than it is for reducing emissions. We noted that adaptation progress is very unevenly distributed, big gaps around different parts of the world, more attention to writing plans than implementing them. A lot of the action already relates to water-related risks, both sea level rise and inland flooding, which are very obvious. We've seen already, and there are technical measures available to deal with them. but also other issues further down in, for example, by restoring wetlands and rivers, having no build zones, for example, for housing in floodplains, that kind of thing we identified as something that's important. It's also important in the urban context as well as the rural context. How you design a new city has big implications for the carbon footprint of its participants. And one thing that we put a lot of emphasis on was the emphasis on so-called blue or green infrastructure in towns and cities, water bodies and green areas that help to reduce temperatures in hotter climates, reduce the need for air conditioning, but also provide more pleasant environments. So it's basically adapting to climate change and helping to reduce emissions at the same time. But adaptation it needs the right institutions, it needs the money, it needs access to technologies and building up the capacity among professions and labour forces to actually take it through. Now, I'm going to just spend just a couple of minutes at the end talking, since this is the campaign for the protection of rural England, to talk a bit about the land, the way that IPCC has approached land issues. And in the last cycle, we did produce a special report on climate change and land, which had the laborious full title on the right-hand side of the figure, which reflects the fact that multiple countries wanted different things out of the report. Certain countries, say in the Middle East or North Africa, wanted a report on desertification and land degradation, whereas other countries wanted a report on agriculture and food systems. And the climate change and land was a compromise. So you can see the horrible title, Climate Change, Desertification, Land Degradation, Sustainable Land Management, Food Security, and Greenhouse Gas Fluxes in Terrestrial Ecosystems. And it was a heroic effort by the authors to make a coherent report out of that. But just a few key conclusions. Land is itself, without climate change, under huge pressure from human exploitation. Land can also be part of the solution to climate change. There are many mitigation and adaptation measures, but a strong emphasis that land can't solve all of our problems. We do need to get to the question of fossil fuels and emissions as well. So you can see a set of conclusions that have been pulled out from that special report on climate change and land. It is the principal basis for human livelihoods and well-being. It gives us food, fresh water, and other ecosystem services, including biodiversity. We as humans have affected more than 70% of the land surface, and there are many responses that not only help to contribute to climate change adaptation mitigation, but can enhance food security. And one point to be made at the end, right at the last 2 points, although most response options can be applied without competition for land, there are certain things like, for example, biomass for energy, burning trees for energy, that do involve land conversion that could potentially have impacts on biodiversity and food security, especially if agricultural land is converted. So in that report, we took a pile of different options in agriculture, in forests, soils, and in other ecosystems to look at different methods that could contribute to the mitigation of climate change by reducing emissions, could help us adapt to climate change, and looked at these other broader issues, desertification, land degradation, and food security. And the impacts of many of these options are quite high. That's reflected by the intensity of the colour. So in agriculture, agroforestry, management of croplands and livestock, grazing land management, integrated water management, etc., all contributing to adaptation. Forests are fairly obvious, but another issue is obviously management of soils as well. Agricultural practices can help adapt to climate change, while at the same time building up the carbon content of soil and taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So mitigation and adaptation at the same time. And at the bottom, other ecosystems, and fire management is one that is now getting a lot of attention. And just one, probably the last slide, I want to flag up the fact that IPCC has a sister body with a longer title than ours, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or IPBES for short. And some of our governments want us to collaborate a lot more with each other, given the nexus between biodiversity, climate change, water, land, etc. And in fact, on the right-hand corner, you can see that I think back in 2021, we actually had a joint workshop on biodiversity and climate change, which signaled the fact that we can work together. And IPBES, just a couple of months ago at its plenary in Manchester in England, actually agreed a new report on the impact and dependence of business on biodiversity and nature's contributions to people. So, and that was a meeting that I went to briefly for a day and participated in and talked to the delegates. So we are actually thinking about these wider issues. David Abura, who is in Mombasa in Kenya, the chair of IPBES, and I speak to each other regularly and looking at ways of collaborating. So I think just one more slide to say what we are going to be doing in the 7th cycle, which started in 2023. Already we have got work on a special report on climate change in cities, which is going to come out in about a year's time. And authors are all working on that. The Task Force on Inventories has 2 reports, one on short-lived climate forces, which are conventional pollutants like sulfur and NOx that have climate implications, and another methodology report on carbon dioxide removal and carbon capture, utilization and storage. And the 3 working group contributions will proceed as usual. They've been scoped out. The authors have been selected. The first lead author meeting took place in Paris in December for the first ever time, a joint meeting of the 3 working groups, and they're about to go into their second lead author meetings. And we expect these reports to start to come out in 2028. One thing that I would flag up in association with the Working Group 2 report, there's going to be an update of technical guidelines on assessing impacts, adaptation and vulnerability. It's been very difficult to measure progress with adaptation, and therefore this report has been requested by the governments to give some indicators and metrics against which we can measure progress. And the final element of the cycle will be the synthesis report, which should come out in late 2029 and builds on the work of the individual working groups. And that's my personal responsibility as chair to put that one together. So I'll draw my remarks to a close at the moment, but just to flag, if you are interested in more information about IPCC, we have a website, we have a social media preference, and we are very much open for business with you. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jim. I feel like I have a lot to absorb there. Really appreciate it. Folks, if you have questions, thank you for those who've already popped them in. Use the Q&A function down below or upvote any questions that you see that you want me to particularly put to Jim. Jim, let me get started. A question from Andrew. Andrew Jenkins, how can we justify the predicted 4 times growth in energy demands, plus the huge demands from things like AI data centers? They require so much energy and water, sometimes equivalent to a large city. How do we kind of square the stark presentation of what the science is telling us, the impacts that we're going to see both globally and on national and local levels? Is there a kind of is there a requirement that we change how we look at notions of economic growth? Because otherwise we're trying to ram round pegs into square holes and hope.
Yeah. It's funny. Square pegs and round holes tend to come up a lot in these questions. Look, first of all, it started with data centers and AI, and can I say first of all that a low carbon future is a high electricity future, because we need to move away from burning fossil fuels directly. And if we have low to zero carbon electricity, it pays to make more use of electricity in the first place. And if you put it in a broader picture, the use of electricity, for example, for data centers and AI, is actually smaller than the amount of electricity you would need for electric vehicles and charging them, if you look at the global picture.
All right, okay.
The issue is that data centers tend to cluster in particular places and cause much more local problems with energy supply. But if you stand back and take it from a more global perspective, we are going for a high electricity world. China is the most electrified economy in the world and has the biggest deployment of electric vehicles. And that's the way we're going to go. Low carbon electricity and high electricity. But the bigger question that was raised was patterns of economic growth. And, I think IPCC authors are like all parts of society. They belong to different tribes. And one of the tribe believes that by being more efficient, we can continue with economic growth if we get the unit amount of climate impact for a given level of economic activity down, the more technocratic approach. Others are much more up for the idea of changing concepts of economic growth and looking indicators. So it's an issue that is covered in IPCC reports, but we are obliged to look at different points of view, and we will report them, in our outputs.
Do you see a trend in either the perspectives that authors are bringing, or the conversations that you have around those IPCC tables, the huddles, the fraught Friday, Friday morning, 4 a.m. moments of people doubling down on growth at all costs, or the kind of donut economics of, there are hard, finite planetary limits. Are there changes that you see, trends in a sort of a trend of global perspective?
The early Saturday morning pains tend to be more associated with governments than scientists, I hope to say. Okay. Let me be very clear about that one. But I mean, Working Group 1 are physical scientists. Working Group 2 and Working Group 3 have many more social scientists involved with them. And, I told you that we had a new chapter in the last cycle on consumption and behavior. And these are bringing new kinds of authors into it that are bringing new kinds of perspectives. So the debates are absolutely there. They're not the kind of things that run till 3 o'clock in the morning with the authors. They will sign off a little earlier than that. But the debates are absolutely taking place. And we have a huge diversity of authors there. So I think, Mary-Ann, you're an anthropologist, aren't you? So we have anthropologists, absolutely, helping to produce IPCC reports.
Great. Well, that's good to know. Hooray for anthropology and geography, and the hard physical sciences as well. Jane asks, Europe may have cut their emissions, but surely, or is that because they're buying products they used to make from elsewhere? So the idea of outsourcing the sin to, regions or countries where they're still running the heavy industry, or the kind of the high carbon, high outputs, high emissions stuff that we buy, we use. We don't want to change our lifestyles, so we'll just get China, Bangladesh, wherever to take our rubbish, make our stuff, and then we'll use it up here. So the idea, I guess, of carbon, rather than focusing on carbon production, looking at the consumption.
I mean, we again in the last cycle, and again scoped into the next report, we'll be looking at consumption-based emissions as well as production-based. And we reported the numbers, and we had pictures showing the amount of carbon embodied in trade. So there's a little bit of truth in the question, but it's maybe not as dramatic, as it looks. There is it is actually involved, and actually the amount of carbon embodied in trade has actually started to decline a bit, as, for example, China gets more efficient and reduces its greenhouse gas emissions. And also, quite frankly, as the trend towards globalization has tended to level off as well, and there's actually less trade taking place than might otherwise have been. So there was a big explosion in terms of these sort of traded carbon in the 1990s and the first decade of the century. It has tended to level off. And still the most important factor are the territorial emissions, the ones in your own territory. So it matters a little bit, but it's not a game changer.
So how do you, so as CPRE or as citizens on this call, how do we translate the global problem to a local solution, or
Yeah.
to, for example, I don't know, having that difficult conversation over the family dinner table of saying, actually, it
Yeah.
does make a difference if you do your recycling or turn the tap off when you brush your teeth, or actually, does it not matter?
These things probably have bigger other impacts. We've looked at the kind of the bigger things that would make a difference in terms of consumption, and a lot of it is energy related at the moment. And unpopular as it may be in some places, the move towards electric vehicles and heat pumps for heating homes are part of the journey towards a low carbon, more high electricity economy. If you want to take it more widely, the other things are very obvious. Flying less and moving towards more plant-based diets would have that kind of outcome. Just to say, we are incredibly difficult about we cannot start preaching to people about how to live their lives. You will never see an IPCC telling people what to eat. So when we did that land report, we were very careful to put the word choice every time we use the word diet. So we said dietary choices of a certain kind result in. And we didn't just look at going vegan. We looked at pescatarian, Mediterranean diets, a range of different diets and their implications. It's up to people to choose, but we can put the information in front of them.
Is that because you know that otherwise you wouldn't get agreement by consensus? Or is that because choice is in an inherent and important part of actually us shifting in the right direction? Or would you, I don't know, if we gave you the magic wand and the crystal ball
Yeah.
and said, Professor Sir Jim, fix it for us, would you uh just make us all be vegetarian 5 days a week?
Yeah. I mean, just to say, as I think all of us have had children or younger children, and sometimes the best way to, sort of direct behavior is not to be, directly prescriptive about things. There are other ways of actually getting there. And I think what we fear with, preaching about what to eat, for example, it's going to have a negative result rather than a positive one. And it doesn't play well in lots of agricultural communities as well. I mean, I have the scars on my back from my time on the Scottish Just Transition Commission, talking to farmers about some of these issues.
So what's the secret then? How do we actually accelerate that change, or just hope that people will come to it in their own time? Because, I mean, with the profound instabilities in global politics and this heightened instability already that we see in the kind of social cohesion and commitment to a rules-based order, commitment to doing things carefully and with consensus. Uh, do you worry that we don't actually have the tools or the institutions that can handle
Yeah,
that pace
yeah,
of
yeah, yeah.
change?
Yeah, obviously, IPCC has been affected by the geopolitical changes as well. The US has written to us and says it will no longer participate in IPCC activities, for example. So that's had a really quite a direct impact. But the way we think about it is we need to keep plugging the messages that we've got already and be persistent about it. We don't have any magic bullet that's going to allow these messages to turn into action. That's the responsibility of the policymakers. We can try to communicate as clearly as possible. We spend a lot of effort on media and social media after the reports come out, but we can't snap our fingers and assume that change is actually going to take place. So we have to be realistic. I mean, like everybody else, we're realistic about the world that we're in. One point that would be made, particularly in the energy side, that a world where you use more renewable energy is a world in which there is less international energy trade and vulnerability. So there are some areas in which, for example, security issues and climate change are aligned with each other.
I guess that makes me think of the recent security report that was published and then quite resisted publication, and then under a freedom of information request sort of saw the light of day but was quite heavily redacted, and then they withdrew some of the redactions.
Mm.
It was quite sobering reading, shall we say. Do you think that there will have to be, or are there the correct global, international, intergovernmental bodies to actually drive change and actually respond to what the IPCC is saying and publishing, the assessments?
I mean, but I think other audiences, as defined, are basically the UN system and the national policymakers for the people who make up IPCC. So I think a lot of it goes into the national policy making and sub-national policy making, cities below the national level as well, because that's where a lot of the action is going to take place.
Great. Okay. A question from Roger Mortlock, our chief exec, who's on the call. Amazing presentation. Thank you, Jim. On the land use point, we're struggling in the UK to manage trade-offs, often with growth always holding the winning cards in the debate. Are there good examples from elsewhere in the world where you think balancing land use is better managed? Balancing land uses is better managed?
The good excuse for dodging that question would be I'm not supposed to talk about individual countries. The bad excuse is that I don't know, because it's not necessary. I just don't have the knowledge. With 195 different countries in IPCC, it's quite challenging. There are countries that we're aware. For example, that special report on climate change was especially promoted, I think, by New Zealand and Ireland, for example, with strong agricultural sectors and big issues about your questions of land use and how it's actually conducted. One of the issues that looking much more globally in terms of land use and land tenure, a lot of attention to indigenous peoples, for example, in Latin America, in parts of Asia, etc. We've just run a workshop on how we engage diverse knowledge systems, by which we largely meant indigenous knowledge. So we had representatives of Sami people, First Nations in North America, Circumpolar Council, etc., Inuit Circumpolar Council, all getting together. And some of the liveliest discussions about land and land tenure are actually taking place along that kind of indigenous peoples kind of axis.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the way those conversations play out?
Well, it's very. It was a very interesting meeting, and I have to say, the workshop we entered slightly nervously, because the indigenous peoples groups can actually be quite assertive in the way that they want to be embedded in international places. But it was actually a very good meeting. We had a mixture of people who were not associated with IPCC, who represented indigenous peoples groups, and we had a mixture of people who were IPCC experts, with one or two people who fulfilled both roles. So we had First Nation people from North America who were also coordinating lead authors within IPCC, for example. And in the end, it was a very respectful and productive meeting that we are currently writing up at the moment, and will be launching in about the report of the meeting in June or so.
Great. Okay, thank you. Just having a look at all these questions. I don't know if you can answer this question. Maybe if you
Right, yeah.
We'll just say it's off the record. No. In the UK recently, Richard Knox Johnson says, recently in the UK, politicians are backing away from measures to reduce the effects of climate change, making popular, unachievable and unbelievable promises, persisting in short-termism in policy and strategy. How do we reverse the current trend? And I guess can you answer that question?
I'm not sure I quite understand the question and what specifically. I mean, it's really interesting. One of the things is, when I did the Committee on Climate Change in the Just Transition Commission Scotland, I was really a policy wonk, and I understood everything that was going on in the UK. I'm now floating off into the stratosphere and don't kind of follow all the policy debates. I mean, I'm very aware at the highest level of pushback against net zero, for example, and the consensus about that has has evaporated to some extent. Although I think the government appears to be persisting with the broad direction. But it's something that it's something that that's happening globally, and we have to take a view on how to respond to it. Which I'm afraid the answer is we just keep plugging away at the messages. We are responsible for climate change. There's stuff we can do about it, and it's up to you to decide whether you want to get on with it.
Why is it that you think you mentioned in your presentation that our excuse me our response in terms of adaptation is slower than our response in terms of mitigation and reducing emissions? Why do you think that is? Is it going to change? And what would you see? I mean, you live in the UK. What would you anticipate that we're going to be seeing in terms of the way, for example, the countryside is going to change over the next 10 years?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the challenge with adaptation, I mean, when you look at reducing emissions, you can usually identify something very specific you can do. There is a mitigation measure, and you can look at the consequence, you can look at the cost of exercising it. Adaptation measures are much more difficult to separate from general infrastructure development or planning. They're difficult to separate out from other ways of planning, economic or land use, land planning kind of activities. And that is why it's much more difficult. And it's actually why we've been asked by governments to produce these new guidelines on how you assess impacts and adaptation, because it's difficult to measure the success of what you're actually doing. And because adaptation is much more embedded with development, you get in with all issues about contested land use and how the land is actually used, much more difficult. Whereas mitigation, you stick a gigawatt size offshore wind farm there, and the fishermen and some people might be disturbed about it, but it doesn't raise the same kind of issue. And a corporate board can take one big decision with a colossal impact. Adaptation much more challenging and touches the lives of many more people.
Is there I guess it comes back to Richard's question about kind of short-termism in politics and therefore policies, whereas actually what we're looking at in this global challenge is lining up the ducks and then all pursuing the same kind of priorities for the next 10 or 20 years. How do you feel like there's obviously commitment from the scientists working with IPCC, from all the kind of experts, but do you feel that governments are dragging their feet to the table? Of course, you said the US has withdrawn entirely. What do we here in the UK do, or perhaps us as individuals working in a campaigning organisation, or spending our pennies to support membership? What do we do to kind of shore up those institutions and actually say we are committed to the long term, the generational change that we need? We want to be good ancestors. We want to be good grandparents.
Yeah, I think one of the answers there, it has actually been helpful to have the concept of net zero as a mid-century kind of target, because it does make governments think 30 or 40 years ahead, potentially. On the other hand, there is a tendency towards mañana when you're actually, doing that. We can leave it to our successors to deal with it. I think, one of the things the last IPCC report actually was looking at different institutional arrangements in different countries for pursuing climate change issues. And the UK actually, with its Climate Change Act framework, is something that's been cited quite a lot internationally, because it has the successive carbon budgets that go beyond the life of a specific parliament. So I think that has actually that kind of structure has actually been helpful in getting people beyond the electoral cycle. of course, what the Climate Change Committee has also done, with my ex-colleague Baroness Brown leading the Adaptation Committee, is flag up the lack of progress on the adaptation side, where perhaps the long-term thinking hasn't been there. And maybe the fact that we are actually seeing the impacts of climate change already may help to drive the message home.
Right. That picks up a question in terms of what the link is between the IPCC, the intergovernmental UN body, and the UK's own climate change committee, who publish these reports of kind of various pathways, various options, and the budget of how to meet our kind of national commitments. How do those two things fit together?
Well, they do. I mean, just to say, I mean, IPCC, we've got 195 member countries, one of taking away one recently. And so we don't have, constant conversations with each of our member countries. We do tend to engage with them there. So, for example, if we have a lead authors meeting in one part of the world, we had a plenary in Bangkok 2 weeks ago. So we ran outreach sessions to engage with local governments in Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, etc. And we would do, the European governments tend to be fairly well engaged. We don't have any specific communication with the UK Committee on Climate Change, but I can remember at the end of my time period there, the special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees had yet to come out, and we were sitting, I had two hats at the same time because I was helping to produce the 1.5 report, but was also part of the audience on the CCC that was receiving it. People anticipated that report and were ready for it when it came out.
Great. A question about young people. Where do young people who've lost their trust in governmental bodies with regards to the climate crisis turn to? Does the IPCC engage in intergenerational contributions?
Yeah. So just to say, I mean, where do the people turn to? They should turn to each other and reinforce each other's actions. And frankly, in my view, self-organization has a lot to recommend it. One of the things that we've done in this cycle is that the Framework Convention on Climate Change has various constituencies of groups that go there, indigenous peoples, local communities, trade unions, youth, etc. And we are now systematically engaging with each of these groups. So one of our vice chairs from Hungary, Diana Urgaborsat, is assigned as our focal point to deal with young people and engage with them on a regular basis. Now, there are only 34 people in the IPCC leadership, and there's an awful lot of people out there. So we do what we can, and we do have methods for doing that. When we have had particularly meetings in Europe, especially in the Scandi countries or the Baltic countries, often when we have our open meeting, they will bring a young person to address us at the start of the meeting to make the plea for action, and could the grown-ups look after the world a little bit better, as it were. So we are engaging with them and do what they can.
How does it land when you've got the young person in front of you pleading to do better? Does it work? Does it do anything? Is it a kind of a media stunt, and you're like, yeah, okay, now let's get on with talking about?
Well, it works for at least 15 or 30 minutes, and then people, tend to get into their issues again. But just to flag out the fact, one of the things we try to do is engage. I mean, what's a young person? For example, is it somebody who's 8, or is it a teenager? Is it somebody at the early stages of their professional career? So young can mean quite a lot of things, and I think we need to differentiate. So we are, for example, we have an innovation. We have a post called chapter scientists within, who help out chapters of each IPCC report. And these will be younger people in their 20s that we recruit, sometimes through open competition from developing countries to help with capacity building there, to try to help to engage more with younger people. And we are specifically asked to look at people as IPCC authors who have previous experience and who are new to IPCC. So we're trying to build in a bit that generational turnover.
Great, thank you. Excuse me. I guess to kind of follow on from that, do you think it makes a difference when either local government, a charity, a nation declares a climate emergency? I mean, it's not a term that IPCC uses. Does it make a difference? Would you want to if you could get agreement on that fraught Saturday morning?
I, the frank answer is I don't know. That's the kind of thing. I mean, we have chapters on policy and national frameworks in which, for example, clever people, anthropologists, etc., have written articles about the declaration of climate emergencies and their impacts. And it's within our scope to assess that literature and try to make sense of it. I think it all came too late to appear in the last IPCC report. It may well be there in the next one. But we can, as IPCC, declare climate emergencies. Our language is very conservative and moderated, as you might imagine. I'm sure there's a question somewhere in the list there about that approach as well.
What happens though if your teams of anthropologists and social scientists say the only way we're going to make a difference is to change the language that the IPCC is using? What do you do then? So you've got scientific advice that what you're doing is too conservative and therefore not landing.
Well, they could put that in literature, and we would have to. We're going in sort of circles now and chasing our tails. We could, we could then assess that literature, but we don't start from the point. This is the result that we must get. This is the outcome. I know some of our authors feel that, but
Right,
institutionally, that's not our goal. Our goal is to assess the knowledge, and it's up to governments to decide how to absorb that knowledge and act on it. Now, clearly, scientists are just like any other member of the public. They have their own opinions, but their unique ability is to understand the science, analyze it, communicate it, and that's the uniqueness of the role of the scientist within IPCC.
got you. Do you feel like we have peaked with appreciation, understanding, and awareness of the scientific method as a knowledge generation system? Do you think that we're now in a post-science, post-truth world, and how has that impacted IPCC's work?
Yeah. I mean, we have to be very aware of the kind of the world that we live in. We will not live in a post-truth world because the truth is our business. So we're not going to change that. But we're aware that our products are going into a world that has really evolved with social media. So we're active on social media. We use it for every report, but we don't respond to all the noise that comes in there. We basically report what we're doing.
Okay, great. A possibly slightly more technical question from the group. What about other gases that aren't focused on carbon dioxide? I know you mentioned others with short lifespans, but
short-lived climate forcers and methane,
yes,
which
there
has
we
a
go.
short
Thank you,
life.
saving me. So the question specifically is, what about sulfur hexafluoride and other F gases? But first of all, you'll have to explain to us what those are and what is the impact, or are they significant?
Okay, we deal with all the kind of pollutants that have an impact on the climate, and they will be covered in our reports. Under the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is our political analogue, their commitments are based on 6 main groups of greenhouse gases altogether. That's how their basket of greenhouse gases is calculated. And that does include sulfur hexafluoride and the fluorinated compounds, which molecule for molecule are incredibly powerful and long-lived in the atmosphere, but there's still a relatively small proportion of overall global warming. And they come from things like transformers and electricity systems. That's a kind of place where they use. But they are in our calculations. If you look at our reports, you will see them. You will see them reported in our statistical parts of our reports. They are all there, and there are things that can be done. But the biggest attention at the moment is on carbon dioxide and methane, carbon dioxide, once it goes up in the atmosphere, stays there. So it's cumulative emissions that matter. Methane's out in about 15 years or so, much more shorter term impact. But while it's up there, molecule for molecule, an incredibly powerful greenhouse gas. So they need treated a bit differently.
Is it within the scope of IPCC to think about how we're, for example, mining the critical minerals that we need for the electrification of the world, the lithium for batteries, the technology that we need for solar or wind or cables or what have you, and the kind of
Yeah.
the knock-on impacts in terms of land use, in terms of vulnerabilities
Yeah.
of already vulnerable parts of the world and communities?
Yeah, it's absolutely within scope because I mean the phrase just transition has worked its way into IPCC reports, and as many people have reminded us, transitioning in can be as much a difficulty as transitioning out. You know, when you look at the impact. So absolutely, the environmental consequences of accessing critical minerals. Human rights within supply chains, for example, labour rights is an important issue as well. It's absolutely within the scope. We are charged with looking at the wider social and economic implications of measures intended to address climate change.
Great, thank you. But again, you don't make recommendations, you just tell us how it is.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So sorry about that. Yeah, it'd be easier if we just told people what to do. Yeah,
Yes, yeah, that'd be great. Yes, please.
yeah.
And then just make us actually do it as well, rather than just tell us what to do. If you could get us to do it, that would be even better. Um, excuse me. The shift from a focus on technology now focusing on people. I love the picture of you standing in front of the place where you had the bicycle and the solar panels and the veg and
Yeah.
the people. How much is that making a difference, do you think? Actually saying this is about people, this isn't about technical jargon, it's not about hard data, it's not
Yeah.
about complicated graphs.
Yeah, just to push back a little, the hard data
It
and the
is also
technical
about that.
still matters.
Yes, yes. Fair
It's
point.
and
Yeah,
not
appreciate
instead
that.
of,
Yeah,
because
okay.
a lot of things can happen on the technical side as well. I think the message has got across. I mean, governments were interested in it, and there was a huge amount of media attention on that chapter in the last report. It's been scoped into the new report the reports that will start to come out in 2028. So I think we have got the attention on that. Some of our authors, particularly on the French side, were particularly pleased to have the concept of sufficiency included in an IPCC report, and the word used for the first time, as French climate policy is built around efficiency, sufficiency, and renewables, and the sufficiency is intended to be how much do you actually need to consume.
Oh, so that in terms of actual sort of behavior, lifestyle,
How big?
the way we
Yeah,
run
yeah,
our
yeah,
businesses.
yeah. How big is your house? Really tendentious stuff in some countries. Yeah.
And how does that land? How how does that land? Is that something that you see very played out very differently in different nations?
Absolutely, very variably. I mean, the French term for it is sobriety. That's how it's used, sobriety in consumption, which has been translated into sufficiency, which I think is a bit of an unfortunate translation because it carries other kinds of baggage that comes with it. But the question of how people live their lives has actually been absorbed into the policy making language.
Is there an appetite, do you think? So every time the public in the UK is polled, or we have citizens' assemblies gathered,
Mm.
the desire for change and the pace of change and the scale of change that might be kind of carrots as well as sticks as well as
Mm.
carrots, so not just incentivizing people to invest in green technology or an e-vehicle or what have you, but also penalizing people for not doing X, Y, or Z that is kind of a pro, livable future. But then when you see it kind of translated into the conversations around policy and how a policy might land or affect an electorate or affect the next local election or what have you, it seems to be massively watered down, that there's a real fear that this would cost us the election if we went hard and said people need to stop eating quite as much red meat and eat more turnips. That's a vote killer. And yet when you talk to a citizens assembly, they're like, why are we still doing this in the spheres where we do have influence in terms of policy? I don't know whether it's a care home or a hospital or a prison or a school.
Yeah.
Why is that disconnect between what is decided in a policy level and what is actually being called for by the citizenry?
You're the anthropologist. You tell me on that one. But just to say, I had the same experience because I engaged with the Scottish Citizens Assembly on climate, and quite frankly, they asked to have extra weekends added to their activities because they got so excited about it. And at the end, they were so much more braver than the politicians in proposing, the kind of things that could be dealt with. And I think, it's the cautions of the caution mustn't make a mistake from the political point of view, I think, is the driver.
A question from Shelley that's just come in: is the impact of war part of the IPCC scope?
It's not been put in. We've also debated the environmental NGOs that who are one of the constituencies in the Framework Convention are constantly asking the issues: do we account for military missions, for example? And the answer is that we indirectly do, but we can't identify them separately because we have a category called so-called bunker fuels, which are for aviation and shipping. And some of these bunker fuels actually go to the military uses, but we don't necessarily know how much. And some countries choose to report their military emissions, for example, under the Framework Convention climate change, and others do not. So it's very well. I mean, there's no reason why it shouldn't be in there. I mean, we have an inventory category that covers military. It's up to, but countries may not always choose to report.
And social and global unrest, is that so the broader impact rather than kind of military
it's a working group to impacts and adaptation issue, because obviously there's the question of migration, which can be related to climate or can be related to wider kind of social changes. So the question of conflict is one of the drivers of migration has been one of the issues that come out. But I would like to make the point that migration mostly refers to things that happen within national boundaries. It doesn't involve crossing national boundaries. It's urban to rural to cities. It's that kind of migration that's taking place.
Right. Okay. Got you. We're going to wrap up shortly, but we're going to stop on two more questions, Jim. Kate says, how on earth do you stay positive in the face of the lack of action by global governments and indeed sometimes the deliberate increasing of emissions by some? So we'll kind of strip out the political implication, but how do you stay positive? You're dealing with the really stark confronting facts of where we're headed, the graph where we should be doing this, but we're actually still doing that. How do you stay positive? How do you get out of bed and put a smile on your face and get to work?
Yeah. Well, I've been quoted as saying that I'm genetically optimistic, and we can debate the difference between nature and nurture and all these kind of things. But honestly, I think there's something that if you're familiar with risks, you tend to live with them, be able to live with them more. And quite frankly, if I get up and out of bed in the morning and I have things to be worried about, they're much more about the micro detail of how IPCC can run rather than the big macro issues. It's my job to get on and deal with it, and that's what I do.
So kind of head down, don't look at the burning horizon.
Well, I mean, you can be aware of the burning horizon, but I mean, I tend to worry about the things that I can do something about, as it were, and focus on these. And you make your own contribution.
Okay, great. That's good advice. One final ask of your wisdom, Jim. Top 3 things to say or do for the people on the call to be able to, feel empowered, influence in the way that they can. What would your advice be? Give us your top 3.
Well, Well, be active in your community, be politically involved as well, because we vote in the politicians that make a difference. So being civically active, I think is incredibly important. You can also make the kind of consumption choices that make a difference as well, if you want to. Keep on talking to your friends and neighbours about it. That's the way. I think that's maybe two and a half answers. Is that enough?
Yeah, yeah, that's good. Are there words that you use or don't use when you're having those conversations?
I have never thought about that. I've never felt myself being stuck for words. Sorry, I can't. I can't answer that one. Sorry.
Okay, cool. All right, I'm going to use the word climate forces a lot more now. I like that. It's good. Um, on that note, please, everyone, join me in thanking Professor Sir Jim Skea for his time and advice on this call, his expertise and insight. We're going to wrap up now. CPRE is hugely grateful not only for you guys joining us on this spring webinar series, but also Jim, thank you again. The third and final session of our spring webinar series is on the 30th of April, same time, 6:30 p.m. And one of our main speakers is Rachel Orr, the Chief Exec of Climate Outreach. We're going to be talking about storytelling, how to make an impact in the way that we talk about these things, how we drive community focus and transform anxiety, panic, horror, hopelessness into action and optimism. The link to register for that talk is coming up in the chat. In fact, it's right there right now. I see it. And if you want to find out more about the campaign to protect rural England and support our work, then we would love that. Sign up for our regular newsletter, sign up to receive briefings on the issues that we think are important, the action that we want you to help us support with. You can also discover more ways to take action on our website. Again, link in the chat. One of our current live campaigns is championing rooftop solar. That's making sure that more of the renewable energy infrastructure that we desperately need goes on wasted spaces like rooftops instead of on farmland and other countryside that is valuable for many, many other things. We'd love it if you wanted to sign our pledge, find out more. The link for that is also coming up in the chat. And it leaves me simply to say thank you, good evening, thank you once again, Jim, and good night. See you all soon.